Welcome, everybody. We're going to start with a couple of questions. And since the topic of the day is about storytelling, we thought it will be useful for everybody if you can all share with us your story. How did you become a climate activist or a sustainability activist? And we'll go by the order that Andrea introduced you. So we'll start with Tim. You might want to unmute.
I'm so proud to be the first one among us to run into the mute issue. So I'm going to tell you one of my climate stories, because I think we all have lots of them probably. I'll tell you this. So I'm an Irish kid from an Irish family, and I grew up in a pretty tough family with a fair amount of violence and sexual abuse and firearms and rape and all kinds of things like that. We had a little 1/4 acre of woods next to my house that was the safe place and was a sanctuary to me. And yeah, when I was 13 years old, I got a letter from Jacques Cousteau, who, if you're young, Jacques Cousteau had a big television show called The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau. This was 1976, and he described at the time the climate crisis as scientists were seeing it at that time, and it terrified me because my church, my synagogue, my mosque, my safe place, my sanctuary was threatened, and I became an environmentalist at that moment.
Thank you, Tim. We move to Jeff.
No, I'm doing the unmute. Thank you, Tim. And everyone, for sharing your stories. And I'm curious. We all kind of find ourselves in here in so many different ways. And so I'll first off by saying I'm Jeff Leinaweaver, but I was really reincarnated as Jeff Leinaweaver. And what I mean by that is I was born in the Civil War in Colombia, South America, and orphaned in the Civil War. And my parents, my now parents, were Fulbright professors teaching theater, of all things, and found me. And it was by way of that synchronicity and a whole bunch of other stories that I say I became Jeff Leinaweaver. So on one hand, I've also really kind of leaned into 1,000 unseen helping hands. But the other ways I've kind of lived into my life is, how do we understand our stories and our sense of meaning and how we kind of practice our destiny? How do we author ourselves by way of not being authored by others and the tensions of society? But I've always had a great focus on social justice issues, cross-cultural issues, transracial issues, poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And I decided to, as a first choice, adopt my daughters also from Colombia. And I was doing a lot of global work. I worked at Amazon. I was getting my doctorate at the time. And when I went back to Colombia for the first time, and I reflected on kind of the privilege that I have, and I was doing a lot around sustainability work with an eco-village north of Victoria. And, you just have one of those moments of once you know, you cannot know. And I never wanted to say to my daughters, I'm sorry. I knew better and I didn't do anything. And so I kind of turned my world into kind of a reversible coat. Like on one side, it's on global diversity and social justice. And then on the other side, it's environmentalism. But I see them on kind of like environmental justice is social justice and social justice is environmental justice. And I've lived into that. I just don't want to say, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Jeff. Taylor?
Yeah, I think as far as my own story, I was born and raised in South Carolina. to a family that was one of a few that we knew of who was like hunting and fishing while Black, which was a very traditional experience for us, as we come from you know, our descendants, our ancestors are those who were enslaved, and hunting and fishing was a way of survival for us, and it's a way of keeping in touch with each other and keeping in touch with traditions, and honestly is a way of telling stories. Stories are a currency in my family, and you know, they're sort of like informal exchanges and battles that we enjoy to connect with one another, especially around hunting and fishing. Yeah, and I think that experience, especially in the deep South, of not only having like gun safety and safety of what it means to be outdoors, but what does it mean to engage with folks who have Confederate flags on their person or who may not be friendly, and knowing that the narrative and the stories that you tell may not be the narratives that are respected when we think about different authorities in the US. So I very much care about outdoors, and I think, you know, really saw it through this racialized lens. My father was a wildlife biologist and was like one of the very few in the state Black wildlife biologists. So that was a really special experience, but, you know, we got a lot of lessons of what it meant to be Black outdoors, which was really important to both my my brother and I. And I went to college. I went to a historically Black university, and really got to dig into, I really wanted people to have the same experiences that I had as a kid, and that was really important to me. And then I started to dig into why Black and brown youth didn't have the same experiences, whether that be for safety or for environmental health reasons. And that's sort of how I ended up in environmental justice. So those stories are really important to me, and that narrative is really important to me. And I think it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about in my own work. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Taylor. That's great. Harriet?
Thank you, Oren, and it's nice to hear everyone's origin stories and beginning stories. And so I wasn't planning to do that, but I'm going to share a little bit. My family, I was born in Alberta, Canada. My family had been there for some generations, and as I was growing up, the oil and gas industry were prominent. That was how people found their family, how they provided for their families, where people worked. Everyone was connected and still is connected in some way in that province. Alberta's sort of the Texas of Canada. And I think that has helped inform me and know in different audiences that there's different stories that we have, that we tell and we share in different ways. But I was grounded in this very close family. We would get together with my father's siblings every Friday night and have dinner together. And so those family and the importance of family, and staying up till midnight watching the midnight sun in the summers were very important. Having access to nature, growing up in Alberta. But my climate story really, I didn't feel like that was impacting climate. I worked in the early 90s for the International Monetary Fund. I was one of their representatives at the United Nations office. And one of the first things I worked on was the Earth Summit, which was the first time the world came together to address the climate crisis. And to me, working on that, it felt very far away. Climate was happening over there. I wasn't sure where over there was, but it wasn't happening in my world, in my life, to my family. And well, it was. I was just not cognizant of it in a real way. And shortly thereafter, I had children. I did one of the first trainings with Al Gore and the Climate Reality Project. And all of a sudden, front and center, as Mr. Gore talks about, I had this aha moment. The climate emergency, we are living in emergency. It impacts us all. It is not impacting us all the same, in that reason that I didn't feel that right away, but I needed to talk about it. I needed to do something about it. And for me as a parent at that point, I was trying to find out what was out there for me to learn in that space as a parent. And I couldn't find any resources. And so I established an organization called Climate Mama. We were, I believe, the first parent-focused organization to try to help parents have those conversations with their kids, find out what they could do, how we could be empowered to take action. And that was in 2009, and 11 years later, actually the parent movement is growing internationally. I'm happy to be part of this growing climate movement, empowered and motivated by our children, by the voices of our children that are demanding that we act. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about my story.
Great. I just want to remind everybody to use the Q&A if you want to raise any question about the stories that we heard or about the other topics, and also to use the Google Doc that we shared in the chat if you want to share some prompts for inviting people to share stories. Andrea, go ahead.
Thanks, Oren. And thank you all for sharing your stories. I love how, Taylor, you mentioned that stories are currency in your family. I mean, stories are so many things, but I think of so many things that are currency, and I didn't realize, yes, stories are currency. That's really an exciting way to put it. But let's talk now about storytelling, and why is storytelling important, especially now, in terms of climate action, social justice action, sustainability work, change agency? Why are stories important? Can we start with Jeff, and then everybody just dive in?
Thank you. Well, I have a couple of thoughts on that are they connect, and I always say that storytelling is an ancient practice as much as it's a skill. And to pick up on the currency comment from Taylor, it used to be you would tell old stories around a fire, those mythic stories, and they'd act like a cycle. You'd hear that story and you think and kind of roll off. Maybe there are these mythic things. And the whole idea was to feed the story back, to kind of speak back to it and how important that is to kind of that collective consciousness of knowing. And then we have storytelling to communication. So it's like we're on this continuum of storytelling as communion and storytelling as communication. And so why it's important is that, well, one, it's how are we in communion with one another? We don't do we well. We're on one planet and we need to learn how to do we. But on the storytelling side, on the communication, it is sometimes we war too much with our stories about who has the right story versus asking the question, what are we making together? How are we practicing our destiny? Because the reality is we're all living our own individual personal story of who am I? What am I becoming? That's an important part, but that can't subvert the process to where we have 50 different heroes trying to solve the same profit within a nonprofit organization and nobody getting along. Like, we need to learn how to do we well. And so with that, I think, like, on the communion side, or just stories in general, that what people have to say is that change doesn't happen unless the soul's convinced, period. And the only way through that is through story and sharing. And unless we sit with one another and listen to stories, whether they be myths, mythic stories, which I always say are myths are ancient truths told without the use of facts. And then we have other stories of the personal important stories that people have to share, the currency, the ways in which we relate to one another, way we are humans in the environment, et cetera, all the ways we know. So it's that dance between, but unless we kind of create that mix of communion and communication in the right ways, we don't have that kind of je ne sais quoi that we have, your soul's convinced and there's no way to fake that. And then you can't not know anymore. Then the story implicates you.
Wow, I love that you said mix of communication and communion. What a beautiful way to say it. Okay, who else, please join in?
Thank you.
Let me jump in. I love how Jeff reminded us of the importance of the soul and being connected. I think we're, as you mentioned in the beginning, Andrea, we're living in very complicated times. And I think that trusted messenger as a storyteller is critically important now. So where if we're in a room, who is that trusted messenger? Who are we going to really listen to? And I think we're seeing on a broad scale our children, youth voices as truth tellers, as coming through that noise and that partisanship and listening to those, but in whatever and many different kinds of circles, we aren't even ready to sit down to open our ears or our hearts or our minds because we're so divided. So I think that concept of a trusted messenger is also important as part of our storytelling.
I want to jump in. I think the thing that brings trust to the messenger, Al Gore said, I'm going to totally paraphrase it one time, that you don't trust the message until you trust the messenger, right? The thing that brings us trust in the messenger is each of those 4 stories we heard at the beginning, where there's truth in it, where there's emotion in it, where the messenger dares to let themselves be vulnerable. And on a level, you know, there are people who have very dramatic stories about then the cyclone hit my house. And there are people who don't have those. But on a level, if you're true, they are equally anchoring and equally unassailable. And I also think, like Jeff, you know, I think there's maybe 4 stories that are really important. There's this personal story that says to the audience, I'm a human being. We're a human being. We have that in common. There's the heroic story, which is a way to frame the work that you may be undertaking and taking on this climate change work. And I use in high schools and colleges a lot, Odysseus. I talk about Odysseus. There's also the story that fulfills a kind of emotional heft and narrative that sometimes the beautiful, extraordinary language of science and numbers doesn't. It can add to that. And I would add into that, art can do that, music can do that, those things can do it. But stories like Erysichthon out of Ovid is extraordinary in that. There are incredible African stories, incredible indigenous stories. And then the last incredible stories are the history, his story, her story, those things that enliven and personalize those numbers that we're often so anxious to toss at an audience.
I agree with what's been said here, and I also want to really uplift and say, in environmental justice, we definitely use stories when we think about testimony, right? The role of what it means to bring your experience, and that experience not only as an anecdote for changing someone's mind, but as data to a person's experience as to I'm experiencing this thing and it is unjust or it needs to be fixed. And that there can also be power dynamics within storytelling, right? Of I need to tell this story to convince you to care about my life, and whether or not I'm in a sacrifice zone or in any of these other like places and spaces when we think about climate. And then also narrative plays a big role when we think about mainstream narratives and how they shape stories before we even get to tell them, right? Or even when we hear personal stories about police brutality or climate, that the narrative that's already out there really shapes what we hear. And that's really key and important in our own day-to-day experiences, but also has like policy implications, right? For whatever our elected officials want to support or whatever we want to support as individuals. So I think that's also a really key part when we're thinking about stories being used tangibly to shape our lives in this current moment.
Wow, amazing. Thank you all. I want to dive in, but I know I'm going to move it to Oren first, but let's come back to being at war with our stories and who has the right story. Talk about hashtag fake news. There are so many stories. How do we know what to believe? So, but those wonderful, right, beautiful stories that can drive change are so important. So Oren, I know you're going to have some questions about how to do that.
Yes, so I guess the question is not necessarily about right or wrong stories, but what are the important elements from your experience as storytellers? What are the most important elements that makes a story a good one, convincing one, powerful or impactful one? Give us some tips. I see you thinking, so I'll give you a second more.
Well, I'll say that
Go ahead.
I think that to me, the goal of any story is to be retold, right? Ultimately, that's the most successful aspect of a story, at whatever degree that we're talking, at all the different levels. However, stories are belief systems. And, I always say, we need to remember that cult is at the root of culture. The story is a part of culture as well. And, we as humans need to recognize that finite stories have created belief systems that have, created the Holocaust and all sorts of injustices and boundaries of ways of seeing things, or even what goes on in organizations, the role of conformity and blindness to certain things. And then we have the stories that have inspired us to go to the moon or think differently or completely change. So, and then I think of, again, coming back to the role of what's the most successful thing. And that is, gossip is a great example of a successful story. So whatever we do, however we're showing it, it's to me, it's like, how do you make your story absolutely irresistible? And then it just takes on its life of its own. There's a way that you're asking the question that I could also answer it in terms of how to use story to influence. But I think the true goal of the story is to be, it's separate from us. It will be told, just like gossip is a great example of that, right? We just want a positive gossip to kind of carry that story. But there are three elements that I think it's: how do you get noticed in the noise? How do you earn trust based on your audience? Whatever that means. It could be having a crazy sense of humor or whatever it is. That might be the one trust element. And then how do you inspire some type of action or behavior change? But getting all those three aligned is the trick. And sometimes it's not about you. And typically it's not about you. So it's more, how are you a story carrier? To pick up on what Harriet's saying, sometimes the stories come and say, tell me. And so how do you kind of hold that?
I love the example, the metaphor for the gossip. That's really good. Very, very useful. Tim?
I love that you brought up the thing about it not being about you. I think it's always about the audience you're speaking to. And I think that we are multifaceted people. We are an ocean of contradictions. And so there are always different stories for different audiences. The thing that I was thinking when you asked the question was that it has to feel deeply emotionally resonant to you on a level. I'm going to tell a quick story in a story. So I have been blessed to get to have a lot of climate conversations with very, very different groups of people, from Houston oil industry executives and coal miners. And every summer I go and talk in the maximum security prisons. So the first time I did that, I went into this prison and there were these gigantic men, and probably out of some fear of my own lack of masculinity, which is a house that I have lots of closets full of, I wanted to be very tough and cool, so I start doing my climate thing, and I'm talking about parts per million of CO2 and radiative forcings, and I look and I see no one cares. They don't. And you know, when you're in a room in prison and they'd rather be somewhere else in the prison, you know it's a disaster. So I did a very counterintuitive thing, which is I said this poem by Antonio Machado. It's a poem that says, "The wind called on my soul one brilliant spring day with an odor of jasmine. And the wind said, in return for the odor of my jasmine, I'd like the odor of all of your roses. And I said, I have no roses. All of the flowers in my garden are dead. And the wind said, well, then I'll take the withered petals and the yellowed leaves. And the wind left, and I wept. And I said to myself, what have you done with the garden that was entrusted to you? What have you done with the garden that was entrusted to you? What have we done with the garden that was entrusted to us? So the thing I think is, my sense is being vulnerable, being open is always a place of weakness. And contradictorily, it's always the place of greatest strength, and it's always the greatest place of invitation. So, and then we could talk about stuff, you know, but somehow I had to be a human being first, and that poem has resonance for me. And so that was a place to start.
Thank you. Harriet or Taylor?
You know, I was gonna very much agree with Tim thinking about authenticity and the role that it plays in stories, and that some stories are not meant for you to tell. Sometimes they're just meant for you to listen. But I think just keeping in mind like what the role of the story is really key as well. Like what's the purpose? What is the outcome? How strong is the call to action? Is the call to action, I want to make you laugh so that we can build trust? Or is the call to action, I need you to change this policy to change my living situation? That those stories are different and they're built a little differently because of the type of persuasion that's needed to happen in a short amount of time versus something as of a different stakes of like building community and organizing. And I think finding the intersections is really important in stories. For example, I work with public housing residents. I didn't grow up in public housing. That's not an experience that I share. Although I am Black, I do not share the experiences of folks who live in public housing. But a lot of folks who live in public housing have family who live down South, and the South is one of my favorite things to talk about. So a lot of times we catch each other in the middle to make that link. But in higher stakes situations, right, the storytelling around testimony needs to be a lot different because we need an action to happen at such a short amount of time. So I think the role of story and how you are authentically either related to be the listener or, you know, authentically telling the story is also really key in either making those connections or like wanting to make that big action happen through the story.
And I just, I agree with everything that was said. And I would just point again to, if you can know your audience before, you may be in a room with 1,500 people and you're telling a story from a stage and you can't know them. But if you can make eye contact and connect to someone in that room, that can help, I think, also have people hear your story. And as Taylor just said too, sometimes telling a story is listening and hearing. So it may not, you may have one intention or hope an action that's required, but that might be to actually hear others express their stories. And you have to be, I think, flexible in your storytelling to feel that happening in the room, in the circle as well.
Wow. Loving the circle, and all of your stories are so inspiring. We have a bunch of questions. So I'm going to ask Kubras, who's the first question. And this is actually a terrific question because we all do take what we want to hear from each story, I think. But Kubra asks, should there be a reason for the storyteller to worry about the moral of the story being received and differentiated according to a particular listener or reader's perspective? And as well, should we do activities like Q&As, et cetera, afterwards to make sure the message is received as we aimed for it? So is that storytelling? Is that story selling? You know, what is it, and how do we ensure that they take from it what we want them to take from it? And anyone can answer.
I can take a shot at that first. I would definitely say it's super, super, super important to think about how the moral of a story will be received. I work with a lot of youth and environmental justice in the classroom. I try to be really conscious that if I'm telling a story about especially issues like lead and mold and pest and pesticides that can be really linked to shame in a lot of ways, like personally, but are institutional problems, that the moral of the story isn't that anyone who has these issues is dirty and doesn't deserve these things. So a lot of times, even when we're doing like mapping activity, I'll say, well, in this map, we see that, because maps are really great storytelling tools. In this map that we see that, you know, X amount of folks who live here have been exposed to lead, and those folks also happen to be Black and brown residents, that isn't conclusive to everyone, right? Yeah, and you know, I think there's a lot that needs to be unpacked when we think about like those quick stories that we use as examples or antidotes, or here's a case of what we're trying to say, because I think those things can really end up hurting people, or can really, when we're talking about like youth especially, can end up like shaping how they see themselves and others, and can lead to those stereotypes that are tough to shake. So I think that's really important, and having explicitly saying like, this is just a story that's part of this narrative. Here's the data that's linked to what we're saying, can be really useful in sort of clearing some of that air, rather than being like, here's the story of a couple of folks in environmental justice, they need help, someone should help them, and you know, and that's it. So I feel like in my own work, even being as someone who works in the community, I try to be really clear about what signals I'm sending about certain narratives.
I think I saw someone else wanted to comment about this question. Am I? No?
I can, well, I appreciate what everyone's been saying. Well, it's a big question, right? That's kind of a central one you travel with. Over time, I think pick up on Taylor saying, you know, there is a true ethics in storytelling. I mean, I always think of the story as kind of outside of me, and I am just there as the vessel for it. And it's like it's me, the story, and then the audience, that kind of storyteller's triangle. And but there are so many stories that they're just not meant for you, or they're not meant to be told at a certain time, or et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's a in the kind of world of people talking about story all the time, there is an overemphasis on left brain story versus this other, and I think it's a real whole brain practice. And you know, and Tim, by the way, I love that you brought in Machado's poem. Again, we have another interesting coincidence around that. I'll share it later. But sometimes there is no moral. You know, sometimes there's just the mystery and the medicine of the story that it just asked me to say it. But, you know, and Tim, you know, it beautiful, and I love that poem. But there's you know, there's medicine in that mystery, no moral. You felt like you had to say it, and it made the difference. And other times you do need a moral to call to action, and it's just, it's a really complicated thing. But I would say, if you're out there trying and talking about and telling stories, sit and ask yourself, don't go into monologuing mode. Ask yourself, are the stories right now, like I spend so much time doing kind of organizational work and conflict and mediation where stories are like hairballs in organizations. It's true. And there's a territoriality to certain types of stories. And humans are naturally territorial. And I know that we don't, and in organizations, people, the politics, or in social justice issues, so much shows up. And I just think that instead of saying so-and-so is bad or so-and-so is good, and that creating that kind of binary aspect of storytelling and kind of the morals, because sometimes the moral will be, I'm good, they're bad. The subtle thing. I look at it as territoriality is a natural part of who we are as a human species. It just is. It's how we've evolved, and it's how we know, and it's how we share information about what's going on. And so there are different kind of things working around us. And perhaps another way of looking at this in terms of the moral is, maybe we're not at the end of any story, and it's about helping people, and whatever you're sharing, be a part of what's next. I think that the part of the storytelling sustainability and is that we've got to invent our way out of this. And luckily, we've had all our ancestors, because of them, we're here. They've been dealing with the same type of uncertainty, except for now it's that much more complex. And so how do we help, Harriet, thinking about kids, and I'm doing a lot with that, how do we help them practice their destiny? How do we help people see themselves in the future, but not in a warring way where everyone's part of that we, but we've worked out the hairball beforehand, or we're teasing out the hairball because those kind of warring territorial stories or stories about the other are really, can really backfire, and that the shame and the other feelings that can show up, or even the idea of, I try to avoid the word passion, because some people will say, well, I don't have a passion. Or I went to this, or somebody might talk about the place they went in the woods, and somebody might say, I've never been to the woods. Well, how do I even have a place in this? So I don't know, it's maybe the story that we're all telling here and you all are listening, maybe there's the medicine and the mystery in it is that we'll all walk away going, and it'll sit with us and we'll have to cook. I'm just yakking now.
So
you might have to crook, pull me off.
So one of the things I'm hearing from Jeff and others is that storytelling is a wonderful technique to shorten the distance between people and the distance and people that are in the distant future, or people and or places that are far away from us. Like, how do you use storytelling to shorten that distance so people will feel connected to the next generation or to the suffering or conditions in other continents? So that's really useful, and I see it's coming in the questions as well. But I want to bring a question from Candice, and maybe Tim and Harriet can help me with this one. Despite the broadening perspective that has happened in recent years, I still find many Western science audiences reject the idea of a story as data. How might we overcome that rigid perception so we might learn from rich oral traditions? Maybe Tim or Harriet?
So I would say they're different languages, and that every audience requires specific languages. And they're not binary. You can bring data in and you can bring emotion in, and there's no reason to think it has to be. So Harriet and I have been working on a thing called the Byhalia Pipeline in Memphis, Tennessee, that We Act has been doing some great social media stuff with us on. And it's a terrible environmental justice situation. And we had to go in, we went in and spoke before the White House Environmental Justice Council last week. And it's a pipeline that's being forced into a community where they have 17 toxic release inventory facilities. Cancer risks are 4 times the national average. That's compelling data. Then my friend Justin, who's a frontline guy there, talked about the fact that his parents had had cancer, talked about the fact that his grandparents had cancer, talked about the fact that his great-grandparents had cancer, talked about, well, those are complementary narratives. Then it's not data's bad, you know, story good, data bad. We're multifaceted. So how many parts of my audience can I touch, and what are the ways I can get there?
And I think that as we've been talking about knowing, you know, your audience and what works in telling that story to different audiences, but I think that we are seeing this real opening up of the land that we live on, the stories of Indigenous peoples, these stories that have been told for generations, for centuries, that all of a sudden there are more ears and more opening to hear and to listen to those stories too. So I think that, you know, to the question that was asked, I think there is a much wider opening coming that way. And but again, depending on how the audience works, I don't think that, as Tim said, that not telling the science and the data as can enhance those stories or add to those stories as well too, because there are certain audiences that you need to lead with that, and then you can open it up. We're working on this wonderful Our Other Mother campaign across the globe right now with parent groups with that hashtag, and just the outpouring of beautiful storytelling in the lead up to Mother's Day, which is going to be celebrated in, I think, over 30 countries on May 9th, but across this month. But the poems, the art, it touches your heart. And so I think that there is a broader global perspective that we can bring in those kind of stories that resonate. There's a story of the boy who harnessed the wind. Many children read that book, that story. I think that we're bringing stories from other places and then retelling them here in a way that are being heard.
Thank you. So much. I have 2 questions that I'm going to combine because I see that they're both LIM college students, and I know both of these students. So Marcel, and I'm going to ask both, so they're related and interconnected. You can answer either. But Marcel asks, and thanks for the question, Marcel, it seems you all agree environmental issues are directly tied to social justice. With that said, how do you feel changes in how we treat the earth have not progressed further, even though science and stories continue to deliver the message of and propose imminent threat? And then Mala asks, as a student herself, she knows how important sustainability is. And do you have any tips on how to make her friends and peers and people around her see how detrimental the effects of unsustainable actions are? So pick your choice. And I'm going to actually ask for kind of quick fire answers at this point, because we only have about 10 minutes left and still have that big prompt question to get to. So either to Marcel or Mela.
I can start.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that sometimes stories aren't the vessel, they're the paddle, right? They're the way of getting there. So policy is really key. It's kind of, I don't have a lot of positive opinions about having to convince folks in authority or in power that people's lives matter, whether it's related to policing or climate or any of those things, right? That's a lot to ask someone to tell their story, to change their whole life. And in a lot of ways is exploiting the use of a story, from the use of getting to know someone in a personal way to to currency for making a change in resources. So I think that's a really tough sort of situation. And I think there are a lot of structural and institutional pieces around how we do storytelling at a mass level to make change that are really, really hard to like activate in a positive direction. So I think that's a really big, that's a really big challenge. How do we use stories at a mass level to make change? We know how to do that at a micro level, but how do we do that in combination with policy and some of the levers that actually make the changes that we need to see?
So let me take off on what Taylor just said. And we're here at Teachers College, and we need to up our game on what our teachers have and what they impart. And we need to get away from reduce, reuse, recycling to educate, engage, and empower. And we need to change that message beginning in kindergarten on, so that storytelling, it's not just taking this bottle and putting it in the garbage. It's actually, how do I feel? I'm empowered, even though I'm too young to vote. I have that self-efficacy. So how do we create those stories that give that to our students, to our children, to our youngest? And I think it comes through education, through our teachers, through places like Teachers College and the good work you're doing.
I want to chuck in a couple quick things. One, the idea that why has our environmentalism only gotten so far? Well, it's hard to know how far it is because we don't have any idea how bad it could have been without the extraordinary heroic work that's been going on. And it's often looked at as failure, failure, failure. What if it's not? What if without all of those people, where would we be? So that's number one. Number two, in my opinion, the greatest failure of the environmental movement is that we talk within our silo. We talk to other environmentalists. We all agree. We get on the chat channels where we all agree with each other. And what we need to do is talk beyond that. And what we need to do to talk beyond that is use human empathy. And often stories can help us get there. And I would also just throw into that in my opinion, for far too long, we have addressed those who we think are powerful. We need to talk to people in homeless shelters and in prisons and in mental wards. We need to talk to all of the people who we haven't talked to, because the real power is with the people. And those can be small conversations, but that's how we change things. And it's a heavier lift, but I think it's the only one.
I'm loving the panel. We could riff for a while. It'd be great. Just to say that. I agree with everything that's been said, and I would just add a few things that these are really tough questions to really sit with as part of it. Learning from history, I think shaming and blaming and us, them ways of sustainability work don't work. Make people feel bad, put people more in silos. I remember working with this one client in Missouri who grew up hunting and fishing, was a big environmentalist, but he said, I can't get along with, every time I try to talk with people I know on the West Coast, they shut me out because they say I can't be into sustainability and hunt and fish. And he's like, but I'm out there all the time being a part of it. So find new commonalities is one thing. I think one of the biggest problems I see is that people are afraid to be seen caught learning. We don't know how to say we don't know. And here's the deal. We don't know. Nobody knows. This is the biggest issue humanity's ever faced, and we're going to have to face it together. So we should just start with, I don't know, and we don't know together. Therefore, I can't shame or blame you. But like in the work I do in permaculture and at the Eco Village, there's so many people who show up that don't feel like they have a connection to things, and that makes them feel really bad. And I would say there's a lot of stuff I do in permaculture that I do social stuff and kind of the role of kind of myth and ritual and environment. But I had to really get interested in something, get really curious about kind of wildcrafting or other things. So I say get curious and learn in public and be able to share your learnings. And lastly, let's just ask ourselves, because we are on a closed system, what if our mama, our Pachamama, what if the people who are waking up to this, what if we are all a part of Earth's immune system? We are sons and daughters and people of the earth. And what if we are just extensions of this and we're just trying to get to know one another? And why would we war with ourselves when we might just all be part of the immune defense system of stopping this? So therefore, we should just lean into our curiosity with one another, embrace not knowing, and say, I'm going to have a relationship with the world around me. I'm going to talk to, Brother Eagle. I'm going to be outside. I'm just going to learn in new ways.
Mind-blowing. Loving this.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We have really a couple of more minutes, and I would like our audience to leave with a couple of ideas on how to solicit stories from people. What will be a good prompt that you can share with people so they will tell their story? For example, today, in the beginning, an hour ago, I asked you to tell us about your own story. How did you become an activist? But tell us other prompts. Give us other prompts that you're using in your own practice to help people tell their story. And I'm inviting, as you're thinking about your response, I'm inviting the audience to share their own tips and prompts in the Google Doc, which will be available for everybody after this workshop to use. Let's start with Tim.
It's interesting. I'll just say the climate reality chapter I work with has a lot of really good scientific minds, mathematic minds. And I had a friend who's a transgender guy who teaches storytelling in high schools for LGBTQ youth. I brought him in because I thought, and he said something that terrified these guys, which is he said, so how do you talk about climate without using a single fact? And his prompt that I'm going to steal was, what would it be like to write a letter to future generations, explaining what you did and what you didn't do? And I think it's a great, I get all kinds of emotion, even thinking about trying to do that. So that's the one I'll throw out.
Harriet?
Sure. And just there's a dear friend of mine has an organization called Dear Tomorrow, and it's all about that, writing letters to the future. So check that one out. My prompt would be, what makes your heart sing? And what are 3 things that you can do to keep that song singing?
Thank you. Taylor?
Yeah, I think for myself and the work that I do with folks, definitely one of the questions is who's gone on scene in your community? Who aren't you seeing in your community? And the other question, to get to the intersectional pieces, thinking about some of those identity and structural pieces, how has climate, your perspective on climate been shaped by capitalism and race and class? I think it's a really good way to start some of that conversation and thought.
Jeff?
So I'm working right now with an organization that works with primates, and we're talking about story work, but so I have to refer to them as primates and non-human primates and non-human primates and primates, which is kind of tripping me out, right? Because we're all primates, right, of some degree. But I have brought out, so it's top of mind. I used to use this in classes and other kind of community groups, but it's the story of Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. And if you have not read it, go get it. Read it to your kids. Oh yes, woohoo. We are on the same lines. It is the best, and it is shaking up this group of people working with primates. I'm not gonna ruin the story for you, but I'll leave you with a kind of a question of it. Are you a taker or you are a leaver? And how do you approach all the interactions every day? Is a taker or a leaver? Do you leave something behind? Do you give some type of nutrient back? And in the social justice world, you know, I always hear about microaggressions. And my question is, what about micro kindnesses, and how do they play a part of how you live your day? So I think it's on that same way, but please read Ishmael. It will, it's a great story. It will change you. And if anything, it's a good conversation topic with any group you want to meet with. I love the synchronicity, Andrea.
It is, and I will say I've read this book many times, and other than Storytelling for Sustainability by you, my students have to read this in the storytelling class, and that's it.
That is so great.
It is. So, you know, and my question, my prompt to students is, what is that desirable state of the future that you hope to see, and what's your role in getting there? And with that, I do want to thank you, Tim Guinee. Thank you, Jeff Leinaweaver. Thank you, Taylor Morton. Thank you, Harriet Shugarman. I am so sorry if you put a question in the chat box or in the Q&A and we didn't get to it. We apologize. We have run out of time, but let's not be at war with our stories. Let's tell our stories with love, and let's, you know, make those stories of a fully equitable and just future become reality and not just stories. And I thank you all. I'm going to pass this to Oren, who has an announcement on an event and also probably wants to thank you all, but thank you all so much.